in the year of our Lord 1247, when the world was still a tapestry of mysteries waiting to be unraveled, there lived a merchant named Thomas of Bristol in the southwestern reaches of England. Thomas was not a man of great birth or noble lineage, but he possessed something far more valuable in the bustling world of medieval commerce: an unquenchable curiosity about the origins of the precious spices that arrived in his shop wrapped in oilcloth and mystery each morning. As the pale English sun struggled through the perpetual mist that clung to the harbor, Thomas would open the heavy wooden door of his establishment and breathe deeply of the mingled aromas within. Cinnamon from distant Ceylon, pepper from the Malabar coast, cloves from islands he could scarcely imagine, and ginger from the mysterious lands of Cathay. These were not mere seasonings for the wealthy tables of Bristol. They were fragments of dreams, pieces of a world that stretched far beyond the cobbled streets and timber-bird houses of his familiar home. Thomas had inherited the shop from his father, Richard, who had received it from his father before him. For 3 generations, the family had dealt in spices, selling small quantities to the kitchens of nobles and the apothecaries who mixed remedies for various ailments. But unlike his father and grandfather, Thomas wanted to understand the journey these precious substances undertook before reaching his weathered hands. He wanted to trace the path backward, from his shop through the great ports and dangerous roads, across mountains and deserts, to the very plants and trees from which they came. It was this desire that led him, on a gray morning in early spring, to make a decision that would change the course of his life. He would close his shop for a time, entrust its management to his capable apprentice, a young man named William, and embark upon the greatest journey of his life. He would follow the spice routes backward, learning the stories of every merchant, sailor, and traveler who played a part in bringing these treasures to England's shores. Before Thomas could begin his eastward journey, he needed to understand how the spices arrived in Bristol itself. The port was a world unto itself, a place where languages mingled like the waters of the river, Avon meeting the Severn Sea. Ships from across the known world docked at the stone quays, their holds filled with goods that had traveled unimaginable distances. Thomas spent his first weeks haunting the docks, speaking with sailors and ship captains, learning the routes and the dangers they faced. He met a weathered captain named Geoffrey, whose ship, the St. Catherine, made regular voyages to the great port of Bruges in Flanders. Geoffrey was a man of few words, his face tanned and lined from decades at sea. But over cups of warm ale in a harbor tavern, he began to share his knowledge. The spices that reach Bristol, Geoffrey explained, his voice rough as the ropes that lined his ship. They come to us from Bruges or sometimes from London. But Bruges is the great marketplace of the north, where the merchants of the Italian cities meet the traders of the Hanseatic League. The Venetians and Genoese, they bring the spices up from the Mediterranean, having purchased them in the Levant. Thomas listened intently, committing every detail to memory. And these Italian merchants, he asked, where do they obtain these precious goods? Geoffrey took a long drink before answering. That, my friend, is where the true journey begins. They purchase them in Alexandria, in Acre when times are peaceful, in Antioch, in Constantinople. These are the great intrepids where east meets west, where the caravans from the interior arrive with goods from lands so distant that even the merchants who sell them have never seen their origins. The captain paused, staring into his cup as if seeing in its depths the shores he had visited. I have been to Bruges many times, he continued, and I have seen the Venetian galleys arrive, great ships laden with pepper and cinnamon, with silk and precious stones. The merchants who command these vessels are princes in their own right, men of such wealth that they could purchase entire towns with the cargo of a single voyage. Thomas felt his determination strengthen with each word. If he was to truly understand the spice trade, he would need to travel to Bruges and from there find passage to Venice or Genoa, the Italian maritime republics that dominated the Mediterranean trade. It would be a journey of months, perhaps years, but he had made his decision. He spent the remaining weeks preparing. He visited the local goldsmith and exchanged most of his savings for small coins and letters of credit that could be honored in foreign cities. He purchased sturdy traveling clothes, a good cloak treated with oil to repel rain, strong boots, and a leather satchel for carrying his possessions. He also bought a small journal bound in leather, in which he intended to record everything he learned and experienced. On the morning of his departure, as the St. Catherine prepared to sail with the tide, Thomas stood at the rail and looked back at Bristol. The town was waking, smoke rising from countless chimneys, the bells of St. Mary Redcliffe calling the faithful to morning prayer. He wondered if he would see this sight again, and a momentary doubt flickered through his mind. But then the wind filled the sails, and the ship began to move, and Bristol slowly receded into the distance. The voyage across the narrow sea to Flanders took 6 days, though Captain Geoffrey assured Thomas that they had been blessed with favorable winds. The journey gave Thomas his first taste of the hardships that merchants and sailors endured to maintain the flow of trade across Europe. Life aboard the St. Catherine was governed by the rhythms of wind and tide. The crew rose before dawn to adjust the sails and check the rigging. Breakfast consisted of hard biscuit and salted fish, washed down with weak ale, for fresh water had to be carefully rationed on any sea voyage. Thomas, unused to the constant motion of the ship, spent the first 2 days feeling miserably ill. But gradually he found his sea legs and began to take an interest in the workings of the vessel. The ship carried not only Thomas but also bales of English wool, barrels of tin from the mines of Cornwall, and leather goods from the workshops of Bristol. These would be traded in Bruges for the goods that flowed through that great marketplace from all corners of the known world. Thomas learned that trade was never a simple exchange, but rather an intricate web of transactions, each merchant seeking to maximize his profit while managing countless risks. On the 3rd day, the weather turned foul. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind increased in strength, whipping the sea into gray-green mountains of water. Captain Geoffrey ordered the crew to reduce sail, and everyone aboard prepared for a difficult night. Thomas huddled below deck, listening to the timbers creak and groan as the ship climbed each wave and plunged into the trough beyond. He thought of the spices he sought, and how they must cross far more dangerous seas than this narrow channel. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a cleansed sky of brilliant blue. Sailors moved about the deck, checking for damage and setting the sails once more. Thomas emerged from below, grateful to breathe fresh air and see the sun. An older sailor, a man named John who had befriended him, pointed toward the eastern horizon. "There," John said. "If you look carefully, you can see the coast of Flanders. We should reach Bruges by tomorrow evening." Thomas strained his eyes and thought he could detect a thin line separating sea from sky. His heart quickened with anticipation. Bruges was merely the first step on his journey, but it represented the beginning of something momentous. The approach to Bruges was unlike anything Thomas had imagined. The city did not sit directly on the coast, but was connected to the sea by a series of canals and the river Zwin. As the St. Catherine navigated these waterways, Thomas saw a landscape of flat fields and windmills, of small villages clustering around church towers, and everywhere the glint of water reflecting the sky. Bruges itself rose before him like a vision from an illuminated manuscript. Church spires pierced the heavens, and the sound of bells cascaded across the water, marking the hours of the day. The canals were crowded with boats of every description, great merchant vessels like the St. Catherine, smaller craft laden with local produce, and elegant barges that carried wealthy merchants and nobles through the city's waterways. Captain Geoffrey navigated to a wharf near the center of the city. where warehouses lined the canal and porters waited to unload cargo. The activity was extraordinary. Men shouted in a dozen languages, cranes swung bales and barrels through the air, and everywhere was the bustle of commerce. Thomas stood on the deck, overwhelmed by the sensory assault of sounds, sights. "Welcome to Bruges," Geoffrey said, coming to stand beside him. "The marketplace of the north. Here you will find merchants from every corner of Christendom and beyond. Venetians and Genoese, traders from the German cities, Spaniards and Portuguese, even occasionally merchants from the Moorish lands. If it can be bought or sold, you will find it in Bruges." Thomas descended the gangplank on unsteady legs, his feet needing to reland the stability of solid ground. He had letters of introduction from several Bristol merchants to their counterparts in Bruges, and his first task was to present these and establish his credibility. The world of medieval commerce ran on trust and reputation, and a stranger without proper introductions would find all doors closed to him. The approach to Venice was carefully controlled. Pilots came out from the city to guide the galleys through the complex channels of the lagoon, avoiding the shallows and sandbanks that could trap an unwary vessel. Captain Morosini stood at the prow, calling out occasional corrections as they made their way toward the great basin of San Marco, the heart of Venice's maritime power. Thomas had heard descriptions of Venice, but nothing had prepared him for the reality. The city seemed impossible, a defiance of natural law, and yet here it was, not only existing but thriving as one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in Christendom. Buildings of remarkable beauty lined the canals, their facades decorated with intricate stonework and occasional touches of color. Churches with domes covered in gold leaf caught the morning light. Palaces of merchant princes rose directly from the water, their private docks crowded with boats and gondolas. The galley maneuvered into a space at the quay near the Arsenal, Venice's great shipyard and naval base. The activity was extraordinary. Ships were being built, repaired, and loaded with cargo. Workers swarmed over vessels in various stages of construction. The sound of hammering and sawing filled the air, along with the shouts of foremen and the constant splash of water against hulls and pilings. Thomas disembarked with his few possessions, grateful once again to feel solid ground beneath his feet, even if that ground was Venice's unique combination of wooden piles driven into the lagoon bed. He had letters of introduction to Venetian merchants, provided by both Master Peter in Bruges and the Spanish merchant, Diego in Cadiz. His task now was to present these letters and hope that he could gain the trust and cooperation of the Venetians, who, as he had been repeatedly warned, guarded their commercial secrets more jealously than most kingdoms guarded their borders. He found lodging in a modest inn near the Rialto, the ancient heart of Venice's commercial district. His room was small but clean, with a narrow window that looked out over a canal where gondolas and cargo boats passed in an endless stream. The sounds of the city were constant, voices calling in the Venetian dialect, the splash of oars, the ring of church bells marking the hours, the cries of street vendors, and occasionally the music of singers or instrumentalists performing for coins. Venice operated according to its own rhythms and customs, and Thomas spent his first days simply trying to understand the basic geography and social structure of the city. He learned that Venice was divided into 6 districts called sestieri, each with its own character and specializations. He discovered that the Grand Canal, that great S-curve of water that split the city, was the main thoroughfare lined with the palaces of the wealthy. He found the Rialto market, where goods from across the known world were bought and sold, where the air was filled with 1,000 scents and languages, and where fortunes changed hands with a handshake and a word. Thomas's first meeting with a Venetian merchant family came through the letter from Master Peter in Bruges. It was addressed to the House of Contarini, one of Venice's old noble families with extensive trading interests throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The Conterni Palace was located on the Grand Canal, an impressive structure that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth and power. Thomas was received by Giovanni Contarini, a man perhaps 10 years older than himself, with the sharp eyes and calculating manner common to successful merchants. Giovanni read the letter from Bruges carefully, occasionally glancing up to study Thomas as he did so. Finally, he set the letter aside and spoke in fluent though accented English. "Master Thomas of Bristol, Master Peter speaks well of you and of your unusual quest to understand the spice trade from its origins to its final destinations. This is, as he says, uncommon. Most merchants are content to know only their own small part of the chain. Why do you wish to know more?" Thomas had refined his answer during his journey. "Master Giovanni, I believe that the merchant who understands the complete picture, who knows not only what goods cost in his own market, but why they cost that amount, who understands the risks and opportunities at each stage of the journey, such a merchant has an advantage over those who operate in ignorance. Moreover, I confess a personal fascination with distant lands and peoples. The spices I sell connect me to parts of the world I may never see, and I wish to understand those connections as fully as possible." Giovanni nodded slowly. A philosophical answer, but perhaps an honest one. "Very well, I will help you as I am able, both for Master Peter's sake and because your approach interests me. The Venetian Republic has grown powerful by understanding trade better than our competitors, by controlling information as well as goods. What you seek to do on an individual level, we have done as a state." He called for wine and sweetmeats, and as they refreshed themselves, Giovanni began to explain the Venetian approach to the spice trade. "Our strength," he said, "lies in our connections in the Levant and our control of the sea routes. We maintain permanent trading posts in Alexandria, in Acre, in Constantinople. We have treaties with the Mamluk sultans of Egypt and the Byzantine emperors. We transport Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land and bring back spices, silk, and precious goods from the East." He stood and moved to a large map that hung on the wall, a beautiful work of art that showed the Mediterranean and the lands beyond. "The spices you seek originate in places far beyond even this map. Pepper comes primarily from the Malabar coast of India, cinnamon from Ceylon and Java, cloves from islands called the Moluccas, so distant that the journey takes many months, nutmeg from nearby islands, ginger from various parts of India and Cathay." Thomas approached the map, studying it with intense interest. He could see the Mediterranean clearly marked, with Venice prominently displayed. To the east lay the Holy Land, Arabia, Persia, India sketched in with less precision as the distances increased. Beyond lay vague representations of Cathay and other legendary lands. "These spices," Giovanni continued, "are gathered by local people and sold to merchants who transport them to intrepids, gathering places. Some go to ports on India's western coast, where Arab and Persian merchants have traded for centuries. From there, they are transported either by sea up the Persian Gulf to Basra, and then overland to Baghdad and Damascus, or by sea through the Arabian Sea and Red Sea to ports in Egypt. Some also travel overland through Central Asia on what the ancients called the Silk Road, though that route has become dangerous and less used in recent times." "And Venice?" Thomas asked. "Where does Venice enter this chain?" "We are the bridge between East and West. Our merchants travel to Alexandria and to the ports of the Levant. We purchase spices from the Arab and Jewish merchants who have brought them from the interior. We transport these goods by ship to Venice, and from here they are distributed throughout Europe. It is a profitable trade, but also a dangerous one. Ships are lost to storms or pirates. Cargoes are sometimes seized by hostile powers. The prices in the East fluctuate based on the harvest and political conditions. And always, There are competitors seeking to undercut us or discover alternative routes. Over the following weeks, Giovanni introduced Thomas to other members of the Venetian trading community. He met ship captains who had sailed to Alexandria dozens of times, merchants who specialized in particular types of spices, craftsmen who processed and packaged the goods for European markets, and even a few individuals who had traveled deep into the Levant and could describe the great caravans that brought goods from the interior to the coastal ports. One of these individuals was Marco Dandolo, a merchant adventurer who had spent years living in Alexandria and who spoke fluent Arabic in addition to Italian, Greek, and passable French and German. Marco was younger than Giovanni, perhaps 30 years old, with sun-darkened skin and a restless energy that suggested someone more comfortable traveling than staying in one place. "You want to truly understand the spice trade?" Marco said when Giovanni introduced them. "Then you must go to the source. You must travel to Alexandria, to the great markets where the caravans arrive from the interior. Only there will you see how the spices truly change hands, how prices are negotiated, how the goods are inspected and graded. Venice is merely the final step in a very long journey." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. I had hoped to do exactly that, but I have been told that such a journey would be difficult for a Christian merchant. Marco laughed. "Difficult, yes. Impossible, no. I have done it many times. The Mamluks, who rule Egypt, are practical men. They care more for the taxes and fees they collect from trade than for the religion of the merchants who pay them. As long as you conduct yourself with respect, pay what is required, and do not attempt to proselytize or cause trouble, you will find that business can be done. I return to Alexandria next month on a Venetian galley. If you wish, I can arrange for you to accompany me." Thomas could hardly believe his fortune. This was exactly what he had hoped for but had not dared to expect. "I would be grateful beyond measure," he said. "What must I do to prepare?" "First," Marco said, "you must obtain permission from the Venetian authorities. Foreigners cannot simply travel on our ships to the Levant without proper authorization. You will need letters explaining your purpose and establishing your good character. Giovanni can help with this. Second, you must prepare yourself mentally and physically for a land very different from England or even Italy. Egypt is hot, the customs are strange, and you will be far from any protection your own country might offer. And third, you must learn at least a few words of Arabic. I will teach you some basic phrases, enough to show respect and conduct simple transactions." The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Giovanni Cantarini used his influence to secure the necessary permissions from Venetian officials, presenting Thomas as a merchant seeking to expand his knowledge of the trade for the benefit of future business relationships with Venice. Thomas met with the English consul in Venice, a merchant named Richard de Burton, who maintained connections with English traders, and who could provide him with letters that might prove useful in Alexandria. Marco Dandolo proved to be an excellent teacher. He introduced Thomas to the basics of Arabic, starting with greetings and common courtesies. "When you meet a Muslim merchant," Marco explained, "you say, 'As-salamu alaikum,' which means, 'Peace be upon you.' He will reply, 'Walaikumus salam,' meaning, 'and upon you peace.' These small courtesies matter greatly. They show that you respect the culture and customs." Thomas practiced these phrases diligently, along with words for basic trade goods, numbers, and simple questions. His pronunciation was poor at first, but Marco was patient, correcting him repeatedly until the sounds became more natural. Thomas also learned about Islamic customs regarding food, prayer times, and social interaction. He would need to be respectful of practices that might seem strange to a Christian European. He purchased clothing more suitable for the Egyptian climate, lighter fabrics and colors that would not show the dust of travel. He invested in a good traveling chest for his possessions and purchased trade goods that Marco assured him would be useful in Alexandria, fine English wool cloth, quality metalwork, and some of the beautiful decorated manuscripts for which English craftsmen were known. During this time, Thomas also explored Venice more thoroughly, understanding that this city was the model of what a successful trading state could achieve. He visited the great shipyard of the Arsenal, where he witnessed the famous efficiency of Venetian ship construction. He was told that in times of war, the Arsenal could produce a complete galley in a single day. Such was the organization of the workers and the standardization of parts. He attended Mass at the great Basilica of San Marco. That magnificent church decorated with mosaics of gold and precious stones, filled with treasures brought from across the Mediterranean. The building itself was a testament to Venice's wealth and its connections with the Byzantine East. Thomas prayed there for the success of his journey and for protection in the foreign lands he was about to enter. He walked the narrow streets and bridges, getting lost in the maze of canals and alleys, always finding his way back eventually by following the flow of foot traffic toward the Rialto or San Marco. He ate in small taverns where Venetian merchants gathered, listening to their conversations about trade routes and market conditions, about political developments in distant lands, about ships that had been lost and fortunes that had been made. Finally, the day of departure arrived. The galley that would carry them to Alexandria was named the San Teodoro, after one of Venice's patron saints. It was a large vessel, heavily armed, for the eastern Mediterranean could be dangerous. Mamluk Egypt and Christian Venice might be trading partners, but pirates respected no such relationships, and there were always those who would prefer to take goods by force, rather than purchase them fairly. Thomas said farewell to Giovanni Cantarini, who had become not just a contact, but something approaching a friend. Be careful in Alexandria, Giovanni advised. Marco is a good guide, but remember that you are a foreigner in a foreign land. Watch, listen, and learn, but do not involve yourself in matters that do not concern you. The politics of the Levant are complex and dangerous, and a foreign merchant can easily find himself caught up in events beyond his understanding or control. Thomas boarded the San Teodoro as the sun rose over Venice, painting the waters of the lagoon as shades of gold and rose. The galley began to move, oars dipping in practiced rhythm, sails unfurling to catch the morning breeze. Venice slowly receded behind them, that impossible city of water and stone, that bridge between the northern lands he had come from and the eastern lands he was now approaching. Marco stood beside him at the rail. "You have come far already," he said, "but the true journey is only now beginning. Egypt will show you wonders and mysteries that few Europeans ever witness. Keep your mind open, your observations sharp, and your judgments tempered with humility. The East is old, far older than our Christian kingdoms, and it has much to teach those who are willing to learn." The voyage from Venice to Alexandria took nearly 3 weeks, following a route that had been traveled by countless merchants over the centuries. The San Teodoro sailed southward along the eastern coast of Italy, stopping briefly at ports in Apulia before crossing the Adriatic to the western coast of Greece. From there, the galley followed the Greek islands southward, a route that provided shelter from storms and opportunities to replenish supplies. Thomas found the Greek islands enchanting. Each seemed to have its own character, its own history stretching back to ancient times. At one small island, Marco pointed out ruins of a temple to the old pagan gods, columns still standing though worn by time and weather. This land was civilized when England was still covered in forests, Marco said. The Greeks traded throughout the Mediterranean, and their descendants still do, though now under Venetian or Ottoman rule. The galley stopped at Crete, that large island which Venice had controlled for generations. The port of Candia was a smaller version of Venice itself, with fortifications, warehouses, and a bustling market where goods from east and west changed hands. Thomas went ashore and explored the town, noting the mix of Venetian and Greek influences, the Latin churches alongside Greek Orthodox ones, and the presence of merchants from many lands. From Crete, the San Teodoro sailed eastward toward the coast of Egypt. This was the most dangerous part of the journey, for here the galley was far from any friendly port, exposed to storms and to the possibility of attack. The crew maintained constant vigilance, and passengers were instructed on what to do if the ship were attacked. Thomas checked his few valuable possessions and kept them close, understanding that in a crisis, he might have only moments to secure what he could carry. The weather remained favorable, however, and on a bright morning in late summer, the coast of Africa appeared on the southern horizon. Marco pointed toward a distant smudge of land. "Egypt," he said simply, "one of the oldest lands in the world, home to civilization when our ancestors were living in caves. And now our destination." As they drew closer, Thomas could see the low, flat coastline, so different from the mountainous shores of Greece or Italy. The land seemed to shimmer in the heat, and the water near the coast took on a different color, tinged with the sediment that the great Nile River carried to the sea. Birds appeared, wheeling and calling overhead, and the air took on new scents, dust and spice and something indefinably foreign. The approach to Alexandria required local pilots who knew the treacherous waters near the harbor. 2 small boats came out from the port, and Egyptian pilots came aboard, men with dark skin and traditional clothing, speaking rapid Arabic to the ship's officers. Marco translated when necessary, explaining that they were negotiating the fees for pilotage and arranging for the ship to dock at the appropriate wharf. Alexandria rose before them, a city both ancient and vibrant, stretching along the coast with its mosques and towers and the remnants of earlier civilizations. Thomas could see the lighthouse, though not the famous pharos of ancient times, which had been destroyed by earthquakes centuries before, but a more modest structure that still guided ships to harbor. He saw fortifications, both old walls that dated back to antiquity and newer constructions built by the Mamluk rulers. He saw hundreds of ships at anchor or tied to quays, vessels from across the Mediterranean and beyond, all drawn by the magnetism of trade. The San Teodoro maneuvered into a space at a stone wharf near the customs house. Immediately, they were surrounded by officials, port workers, merchants offering services, and curious onlookers. The noise was overwhelming after weeks at sea. Voices in Arabic, Greek, Italian, and languages Thomas could not identify. The braying of donkeys, the crash of cargo being loaded and unloaded, the calls of street vendors. Marco handled the formalities with practiced ease, presenting documents to the customs officials, paying the required fees, and negotiating with the porters who would transport their goods to the warehouse district. Thomas followed, trying to take in everything at once while not appearing too obviously foreign and overwhelmed. If Thomas truly wanted to complete his understanding, he would need to travel further east. This was a daunting prospect. The journey to Alexandria had taken months and had pushed the boundaries of what most English merchants would consider reasonable. To go beyond, into lands where Christians were rare and where his language and customs would be completely alien, seemed almost impossible. Yet the desire to know, to truly understand, remained strong. One evening, discussing this dilemma with Marco and Abraham, he raised the possibility of continuing eastward. Marco looked thoughtful. "It has been done," Marco said slowly. "I have met merchants who claim to have traveled to India, though I cannot verify their stories. The voyage is long and dangerous, and most Europeans who attempt it never return. But if you are truly determined, it might be possible. There are ships that sail from Aden to the Malabar coast, and if you could secure passage on such a vessel, Abraham shook his head. "I would not recommend it, Master Thomas. You have already traveled further than most merchants ever do. The knowledge you have gained is valuable. Return to Bristol, apply what you have learned, prosper in your trade. Do not risk your life for curiosity alone." Thomas considered this advice carefully. Abraham was right that he had already learned much of great value. His understanding of the spice trade was now far beyond that of his competitors in England. He could judge quality better, understand fluctuations in price, and perhaps most importantly, he had made connections with merchants throughout the trading network. But the question still tugged at him. If he did not attempt to go further, he would always wonder what he might have discovered. The origins of the spices would remain mysterious, known to him only through the reports of others. "I will think on it," he said finally. "But if I am to attempt such a journey, I must prepare carefully and seek the guidance of those who know these routes." As autumn approached and the intense heat of the Egyptian summer began to moderate, Thomas found himself at a crossroads. He had spent nearly a year away from Bristol, traveling from England through Bruges to Venice and finally to Alexandria. He had learned more about the spice trade than he had ever imagined possible. But the heart of the mystery, the actual lands where the spices originated, still lay beyond his reach. He had sufficient funds remaining to either return home or to continue eastward, but not enough for both. If he chose to travel deeper into Asia, he would be committing himself to an extended absence, perhaps 2 or 3 more years before he could return to England. His shop in Bristol was in the capable hands of his apprentice William, but he could not expect the young man to manage indefinitely without guidance. His friends and family would worry. He might miss important events or opportunities at home. On the other hand, if he returned now, he would carry valuable knowledge, but also the nagging sense of an incomplete quest. He would have traced the spice routes to their Mediterranean terminus, but he would not have seen the pepper vines of Malabar, the cinnamon trees of Ceylon, the clove trees of the Moluccas. These would remain as distant and mysterious to him as they were to every other English merchant. He discussed the question with Marco, who had decided to remain in Alexandria through the winter before returning to Venice in the spring. Marco's advice was pragmatic. "Consider what you hope to achieve," he said. "If your goal is purely commercial, to gain knowledge that will help you in your trade, then you have already accomplished that. You understand how spices reach Europe, how to judge their quality, and you have made valuable contacts who can help you purchase goods more effectively. But if your goal is something larger, if you seek understanding for its own sake, or if you dream of seeing lands that few Europeans ever visit, then you must continue. Only you can decide which matters more." Abraham's counsel was more cautious. "The journey to India is dangerous, Master Thomas. Ships are lost in storms. Travelers fall ill with fevers unknown in Europe. Pirates prey on merchant vessels. And even if you survive the journey, you will find yourself in lands where you have no protection, no rights, no recourse if things go wrong. I do not say this to discourage you, but you must understand the risks." Thomas prayed on the matter, attending services at the Coptic church where the city's small Christian community gathered. He walked the streets of Alexandria, thinking about all he had seen and learned. He stood at the harbor, watching ships arrive from distant ports, their holds filled with treasures that had traveled unimaginable distances. Finally, he made his decision. He would continue eastward, not all the way to India, for that seemed too ambitious and dangerous, but at least as far as Aden, the great port at the southern end of the Red Sea, where goods from the Indian Ocean trade arrived before being transported north to Egypt. From Aden, he could observe ships arriving from India and speak with the merchants who made those journeys. He might even find an opportunity to travel further if circumstances allowed. Once the decision was made, he felt a sense of relief and renewed purpose. He began making preparations immediately. Abraham helped him purchase goods that would be valuable in Aden: quality cloth, metalwork, and glass beads that were prized for trade with East African kingdoms. Marco introduced him to a Yemeni merchant named Abdullah, who traded between Alexandria and Aden and who could provide guidance and potentially passage on a southbound vessel. Abdullah proved to be a sophisticated businessman who spoke Arabic, Italian, and some Greek. He had been making the journey between Egypt and Yemen for 20 years and knew the Red Sea as well as anyone. When Thomas explained his desire to travel to Aden, Abdullah studied him carefully. "This is unusual," Abdullah said. "Few European merchants travel beyond Alexandria. The Venetians and Genoese come here to purchase goods and return to their own lands. You wish to go to the source, to see where the caravans from the interior arrive. This shows wisdom, but also courage, for the journey is not easy. Will you take me?" Thomas asked. Abdullah considered. "I have a ship departing in 3 weeks for Jeddah and then Aden. I can offer you passage if you are willing to work. I do not carry idle passengers. Everyone aboard must contribute to the success of the voyage. You would help manage cargo, keep accounts, and assist in any way needed. In return, you would have a place to sleep, adequate food, and safe arrival at our destination, God willing." Thomas agreed immediately. This was more than he had hoped for. 3 weeks gave him time to finalize his affairs in Alexandria, send letters back to Bristol explaining his continued absence, and purchase the few additional supplies he would need. He spent his remaining time in Alexandria saying farewells to the merchants who had helped him. Ahmad al-Misri presented him with a small quantity of the finest pepper, a gift for a fellow merchant. Hassan, the cinnamon specialist, gave him samples of different grades of cinnamon to study. Abraham provided letters of introduction to Jewish merchants in Aden who could assist Thomas if needed. On his final evening in the city, Thomas stood on the roof of the Khan al-Khalili, looking out over Alexandria as the sun set. The call to prayer echoed from the mosques, a sound that had become familiar over his months in the city. The Mediterranean stretched northward, leading back to Venice, to Bruges, to home. But tomorrow he would turn south, following the ancient route down the Red Sea toward lands he'd only imagined. He made his way through narrow streets paved with stone, past houses with elaborate facades and workshops where craftsmen plied their trades. The wealth of Bruges was evident in every detail, in the fine clothes worn by merchants, in the elaborate decorations of guild halls, in the quality of goods displayed in shop windows. This was a city grown rich on trade, where information and connections were as valuable as gold. His first letter of introduction was addressed to a merchant named Peter van der Heyden, whose establishment was located near the Great Market Square. Thomas found the building easily enough, an impressive structure of brick and stone with large windows of actual glass, a luxury rarely seen in Bristol. He knocked on the heavy oak door and was admitted by a servant who examined him with barely concealed suspicion. "Master." Peter proved to be a man of middle years, prosperous and shrewd, with the calculating gaze of someone who made his living by accurately assessing the value of goods and men. He read the letter from Thomas's colleague in Bristol, then studied Thomas himself before speaking. "So, Master Thomas," he said in accented but fluent English, "you wish to learn about the spice trade. This is unusual. Most merchants are content to buy and sell without concerning themselves with the origins of their goods. What drives this curiosity?" Thomas had prepared for this question. "Master Peter, I believe that understanding the full journey of the spices will allow me to better judge their quality, to better serve my customers, and perhaps to discover opportunities that others might miss. Knowledge, I have come to believe, is as valuable as the goods themselves." Peter nodded slowly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "A wise answer. Very well, I will help you as much as I am able, both for the sake of my colleague in Bristol and because I appreciate your approach. The spice trade is indeed a fascinating business, full of wonders and dangers in equal measure. He gestured for Thomas to sit and called for his servant to bring wine. Thus began Thomas's education in the realities of medieval trade. Thomas spent 3 weeks in Bruges, and much of that time was spent in the house and warehouse of Peter van der Heyden, learning the intricacies of the trade that would carry him eastward. Master Peter proved to be a patient teacher, understanding that Thomas's quest for knowledge was genuine and potentially valuable. The van der Heyden warehouse was a revelation. It occupied an entire building near the canal, its interior dim and cool, filled with the mingled scents of goods from across the known world. There were bales of wool from England and Spain, furs from the northern lands, amber from the Baltic, beautiful cloth from Flemish looms, and, in a locked room at the rear, the precious spices that were the focus of Thomas's interest. Peter unlocked this chamber and led Thomas inside. The aroma was overwhelming, a complex mixture that seemed to contain entire worlds. Sacks of pepper, the most common and valuable of spices, stood against one wall. Bundles of cinnamon, each stick carefully wrapped, occupied wooden bins. Cloves, like tiny dried flowers, filled earthenware jars. Ginger root, gnarled and strange, rested in baskets. Nutmeg and mace. Saffron threads like captured sunlight, cardamom pods, and many other spices Thomas could not immediately identify completed the inventory. These, Peter said, gesturing around the room, represent the culmination of journeys of miles and many months. Each type has its own story, its own route, its own chain of merchants and middlemen who pass it from hand to hand until it reaches this room in Bruges. He picked up a stick of cinnamon and handed it to Thomas. This cinnamon comes from Ceylon, an island far to the east, beyond even the lands of the Saracens. The bark is harvested, dried, and prepared by people whose names we will never know. It is then sold to merchants who carry it to ports on the western coast of India, where it is purchased by Arab traders who transport it across the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea. Thomas rolled the cinnamon stick between his fingers, marveling at its journey. "And from there?" he asked. "From there, it travels overland through the domains of the Saracens. If it went through the Persian Gulf, it might journey through Persia and then to Baghdad or Damascus. If it came through the Red Sea, it would be transported to Cairo and Alexandria. In these great cities, Christian merchants from Venice and Genoa purchase the spices and transport them by ship across the Mediterranean to Italy. From Italy, they come here to Bruges, and from Bruges, they disperse throughout northern Europe." The complexity was staggering. Thomas tried to imagine the chain of transactions, the multiple markups, the risks at each stage of the journey. How many hands does it pass through? He wondered aloud. Peter shrugged. 10, perhaps 15, perhaps more. Each merchant adds his profit. Each transfer point levies its taxes and fees. By the time the cinnamon reaches your shop in Bristol, it costs many times what was paid to the original harvester. This is why spices are so valuable, why wars are fought over control of the trade routes, why fortunes are made and lost in this business. Over the following days, Peter introduced Thomas to other merchants in Bruges, each with their own specialties and connections. There was a Genoese trader named Carlo Grimaldi, whose family had been in the spice business for generations and who maintained agents in Alexandria and Antioch. There was a German merchant from Lübeck who specialized in the northern trade, but who also dabbled in spices when opportunity arose. There was even a Spanish converso, a Jew who had converted to Christianity, whose family connections stretched from Toledo to Constantinople, and who served as a valuable source of information about conditions in the Levant. Each evening, Thomas would return to the modest inn where he had taken lodging and write in his journal by candlelight, recording everything he had learned. He drew maps based on the merchants' descriptions, tracing the routes that spices followed from their mysterious origins to the markets of Europe. He listed the major trading cities: Venice and Genoa in Italy, Alexandria and Cairo in Egypt, Damascus and Aleppo in Syria, Baghdad and Busra in Mesopotamia, and countless others. He noted the various dangers: pirates in the Mediterranean, bandits on the overland routes, political instability that could close borders or raise taxes, the constant risk of shipwreck, and the unpredictability of supply from the distant East. As Thomas's understanding deepened, so did his determination to continue his journey. Bruges had taught him much, but it was still far removed from the true origins of the spice trade. If he wanted to truly understand, he would need to travel to Italy, to the great maritime republics that controlled the Mediterranean trade. Master Peter helped him make the necessary arrangements. Venice would be your best destination, he advised. The Venetians have the most extensive network in the East, and their jealousy over the spice trade is legendary. If you can gain their trust and access to their knowledge, you will learn more than anywhere else. The journey from Bruges to Venice was not simple. The most direct route would be overland through the Holy Roman Empire, crossing the Alps into Italy. This journey could take weeks or even months, depending on the season and the condition of the roads. An alternative was to take ship along the coast to Bordeaux or another French port, then travel overland through France and over the mountains. Each route had its advantages and dangers. Thomas consulted with several merchants who had made the journey. An Italian named Marco Bellini, who represented a Venetian trading house in Bruges, offered valuable advice. The Alpine passes are treacherous, he warned. Late spring is the best time to attempt them, after the worst of the winter snows have melted, but before the summer storms begin. You will need guides who know the routes, and you must be prepared for hardship. The mountains are beautiful but merciless. Another option was to wait for the annual Venetian convoy of merchant galleys that's sometimes called at Bruges before returning to the Mediterranean. These great ships, both merchant vessels and warships, traveled together for protection against pirates and enemies of the Republic. If Thomas could secure passage on such a ship, he would have a direct if lengthy journey to Venice. Fortune favored Thomas. Master Peter learned that a Venetian convoy was expected to arrive within the month, returning from trading voyages to England and Flanders. Through his contacts, Peter was able to secure Thomas a place on one of these vessels, though the cost consumed much of Thomas's remaining resources. The convoy would stop at several ports along the way, allowing Thomas to see more of the medieval trading world. Before finally arriving in Venice. As he prepared for departure, Thomas reflected on how much he had already learned and how far he had yet to go. Bruges had revealed to him the complexity of medieval commerce, the intricate web of relationships and transactions that connected distant parts of the world. But it had also shown him that the true heart of the spice trade lay further south and east, in the sun-baked lands of the Mediterranean and beyond. He spent his final days in Bruges purchasing supplies for the journey, durable clothing suitable for the Mediterranean climate, a good knife, a hat to protect against the sun, and additional journals to record his observations. He also bought a small collection of English goods that Master Peter assured him would be valuable for trading purposes: fine wool cloth, well-made leather goods, and some decorated metalwork from Bristol craftsmen. On the morning of his departure, Master Peter came to the quay to see him off. The Venetian galleys were impressive vessels, long and sleek, with both sails and oars for propulsion. They bristled with weapons, for pirates were a constant threat in the Mediterranean, and the precious cargo they carried made them attractive targets. The captain of the vessel Thomas would sail on was a hard-faced man named Lorenzo Morosini, a member of one of Venice's noble families, whose stern demeanor and sharp commands spoke of years of experience in dangerous waters. Remember, Peter said as they clasped hands in farewell. "In Venice, be cautious whom you trust. The Venetians guard their trading secrets jealously, and they view every foreigner as a potential spy or competitor. But if you show respect for their achievements and demonstrate genuine interest rather than mere commercial greed, you may find allies willing to help you." Thomas boarded the galley, finding his place among the other passengers and cargo. As the great ship moved out into the canal, propelled by the rhythmic strokes of the oarsmen, he took a final look at Bruges. The city gleamed in the morning sun, its church spires reaching toward heaven, its canals reflecting the light like liquid silver. It had been his introduction to the wider world of trade, and he was grateful for all he had learned within its walls. Now, however, the true journey was beginning. The galley turned southward, following the coast toward France and eventually the Mediterranean. Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He was venturing further from home than any of his ancestors had traveled, into lands where different languages were spoken, different customs observed, and different dangers waited. But he was also drawing closer to the answers he sought, to the origins of those precious spices that had sparked his curiosity and set him on this remarkable path. The journey southward, along the Atlantic coast, was Thomas's introduction to the life of sailors and merchants who made their living from the sea. The Venetian convoy consisted of 5 galleys, traveling together for mutual protection. These vessels were different from the English merchant ships Thomas had known in Bristol. They were longer and narrower, designed for both speed and cargo capacity, and their crews included not only sailors, but also fighting men who could defend against pirates or enemies of the Republic. Life aboard the galley followed a strict routine. The passengers, including Thomas, were confined to a small area of the deck and had to accommodate themselves to the needs of the ship and crew. Meals consisted of ship's biscuit, salted meat or fish, cheese that grew harder and more unpleasant with each passing day, and wine mixed with water. Fresh provisions were obtained whenever the convoy stopped at a port, but these stops were brief and focused on the needs of trade, rather than passenger comfort. The convoy's first major stop was at a port in Brittany, where the Venetian merchants traded some of their goods and took on additional cargo. Thomas went ashore with the others, grateful for the chance to walk on solid ground and purchase fresh bread and fruit. The town was small compared to Bruges, but it bustled with activity, its harbor filled with fishing boats and coastal traders. Thomas spent his time observing the local market, noting the goods available and the prices being asked, comparing them with what he knew from Bristol and Bruges from Brittany. The convoy sailed southward along the coast of France, past river mouths and rocky headlands, through waters that could change from calm to dangerously rough with little warning. Captain Morosini proved to be a skilled navigator, keeping his ships close enough to land to avoid becoming lost, but far enough out to avoid coastal hazards. At night, when conditions permitted, the galleys would anchor in protected bays, and the crew would rest before continuing the journey at dawn. The coast of Spain presented different challenges. Here, the convoy had to be vigilant against both Christian pirates operating from hidden coves and the possibility of raids from north, African corsairs who occasionally ventured north in search of plunder and captives. The galleys traveled with scouts posted at the masts, constantly watching for any sign of potential danger. Twice, suspicious sails were spotted in the distance, and the convoy immediately formed into a defensive formation. But in both cases, the other vessels turned away, unwilling to challenge 5 well-armed Venetian galleys at Cadiz, a Spanish port at the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. The convoy made a longer stop. Here, the Venetians traded with local merchants, exchanging goods from the north for Spanish wine, olive oil, and silver from the mines of the interior. Thomas explored the town, fascinated by its mix of Christian, Moorish, and Jewish influences. The architecture was different from anything he had seen in England or Flanders, with buildings designed to cope with intense summer heat. And the markets offered goods from North Africa and the Moorish kingdoms of Granada. He met a Spanish merchant named Diego, who spoke some Italian and who was willing to talk about the trade routes. "The spices you seek," Diego explained over cups of strong wine in a harbor tavern, "they come through many routes. Some arrive here from the east through the Moorish kingdoms, though the trade has declined since the Christians have been reconquering those lands. Most now come through the Italian cities, as you have learned. But there are always merchants seeking alternative routes, ways to avoid the Venetian and Genoese monopolies." "Is it possible," Thomas asked, "to travel overland from here through the Moorish lands to the east?" Diego shook his head. "Not easily, and not safely for a Christian. The kingdoms of Islam stretch from here to the ends of the earth, and while trade continues between Christian and Muslim lands, an individual traveler would face many dangers and difficulties. No, if you wish to understand the spice trade, you must go to the Mediterranean ports, to Egypt and Syria, where east meets west. That is where the great transactions occur, where the caravans from the interior arrive with their precious cargoes." This confirmed what Thomas had heard in Bruges. The Mediterranean was the crossroads, the place where the complex chain of trade routes from Asia came together and where European merchants acquired the goods they would carry back to their home markets. From Cadiz, the convoy passed through the Straits of Gibraltar, that narrow passage where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Mediterranean Sea. Thomas stood at the rail, looking at the African coast to the south and the European coast to the north, marveling that such a small gap separated two continents. The currents in the straits were strong, and Captain Morosini ordered the rows to their benches, supplementing the sails with the power of human muscles to fight through to the calmer waters beyond. And then, finally, they were in the Mediterranean, that ancient sea whose shores had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, whose waters had carried the Phoenicians and Greeks and Romans, and now bore the ships of medieval merchants seeking wealth in the age-old game of trade. The voyage up the Mediterranean toward Venice took many weeks, for the convoy stopped at multiple ports along the way, at Cartagena and Valencia on the Spanish coast, at Marseille in southern France, at Genoa, where Thomas saw for himself the rival maritime republic that competed with Venice for dominance of the eastern trade, and various smaller ports where trade could be conducted and supplies obtained. Each stop added to Thomas's education. He observed how different cities specialized in different trades, how local products were exchanged for goods from distant lands, how merchants negotiated prices and terms in multiple languages, using translators when necessary and relying on hand signals and samples when language failed entirely. He learned about the various coins and currencies used in different regions and how merchants calculated exchange rates. He discovered the importance of accurate weights and measures, and how disputes over quality or quantity were arbitrated by local officials or merchant guilds. The Mediterranean itself was a revelation. The water was a deep blue, unlike the gray-green of the Atlantic, and the climate grew warmer as they sailed eastward. The shores were lined with olive groves and vineyards, with towns of white stone that gleamed in the intense sunlight. The sky seemed larger somehow, and the nights were filled with stars that burned with a clarity Thomas had never seen in the often cloudy skies of England. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of waiting, the convoy approached Venice. Thomas's first view of the city came at dawn, when the lagoon was covered in mist that was just beginning to lift as the sun rose. Through the haze, he could see church towers and domes rising as if floating on the water itself. As the mist cleared, more of the city was revealed, not built on solid ground like other cities, but seemingly constructed on the water itself. a maze of channels and islands connected by bridges. "How do you judge quality?" Marco asked, a question that brought an approving nod from Ahmad. "Experience," the merchant replied, "and knowledge passed down through generations. For pepper, I look at the size and color of the peppercorns, and I taste to ensure proper strength. For cinnamon, I examine the color and thickness of the bark, and I break a piece to smell its aroma and check that it does not crumble, which would indicate age or poor storage. For cloves, I press them to ensure they still contain oil, for dried-out cloves have lost their value. Each spice has its signs, its ways of revealing quality or deception." They spent the rest of the morning in the spice market, with Abraham introducing them to other merchants and explaining the various transactions taking place around them. Thomas watched as a Genoese merchant negotiated for a large quantity of pepper, the two parties slowly working toward an agreed price, through a process that seemed to involve as much social ritual as actual bargaining. He observed as customs officials inspected a newly arrived shipment, checking the goods against the documentation and collecting the required duties. At midday, when the heat became intense and the market activity slowed, Abraham suggested they retire to a nearby coffee house where merchants gathered during the hot hours. Here, in a dim interior cooled by thick walls and the movement of air from high windows, Thomas was introduced to more members of Alexandria's trading community. There was Ibrahim al-Baghdadi, whose family business involved organizing caravans from Baghdad to Alexandria, bringing not only spices but also silk, precious stones, and other luxury goods. There was David ben Solomon, another Jewish merchant who specialized in medicinal plants and compounds. There was Pietro Romano, a Genoese trader who had lived in Alexandria for 20 years and who had essentially become Egyptian in all but name. Each had stories to tell about the spice trade, about fortunes made and lost, about the dangers and uncertainties, about the complex relationships between Christian and Muslim merchants, about the politics that could open or close trade routes overnight. Thomas listened intently, occasionally asking questions, always learning. As the afternoon progressed and the worst of the heat began to dissipate, Abraham suggested they visit the docks where ships from the Red Sea arrived. This required permission from the Mamluk authorities, but Abraham's connections and a few carefully placed coins secured them access to an area usually restricted to authorized personnel. The Red Sea docks were separate from the main Mediterranean harbor, connected by a canal that had been dug and maintained since ancient times. Here, Thomas saw ships unlike any he had encountered before, dhows with their distinctive triangular sails, vessels built using techniques developed over centuries of sailing the Indian Ocean. These were the ships that brought spices from Arabia and East Africa, that connected Alexandria to the vast maritime trading network of the Eastern Seas. Cargo was being unloaded from one such ship, and Thomas watched as bales and sacks were carefully tallied and inspected by customs officials. The smell of spices was overwhelming. A porter passing nearby stumbled, and a sack split open, spilling black peppercorns across the stone quay. Workers immediately scrambled to recover every grain, for even this small amount represented significant value. Abraham spoke quietly to one of the ship's officers, then turned to Thomas. He says this cargo came from Aden at the southern end of the Red Sea. It originated in India, transported there by Indian merchants who trade along the coast. The journey from India to Aden took nearly 4 months, and from Aden here another month. In total, these spices have been traveling for half a year, and they still have months more to go before reaching the markets of Northern Europe. Thomas shook his head in wonder. The organization required, he said, the coordination across such distances, between people who may never meet, who speak different languages and worship different gods. How is such a thing possible? Trust, Marco said. speaking for the first time in hours. The entire system runs on trust, enforced by reputation. A merchant who cheats will find himself unable to conduct business, for word spreads quickly through the trading networks. Religious and cultural differences matter less than reliable conduct. Muslims trade with Christians, Christians with Jews, Jews with Hindus and Buddhists in the Far East. Commerce creates its own rules and its own community. As evening approached and the light began to fade, they made their way back through the city to the Khan al-Khalili. Thomas was exhausted but exhilarated. In a single day, he had seen more of the actual functioning of the spice trade than in all his previous months of travel and inquiry. He had witnessed the point where goods from the East entered the Mediterranean world, where the mysterious became tangible, where the exotic was sorted and graded and sold like any other commodity. That evening, he wrote extensively in his journal, trying to capture everything he had seen and learned. The complexity of the trade amazed him, but also the human element, the merchants, who had built their businesses on understanding quality and maintaining relationships, the officials who regulated the flow of goods, the humble porters and sailors whose labor made the entire system function. It was a vast machine, certainly, but a machine built from human relationships, human knowledge, and human effort. Thomas remained in Alexandria for 2 months, learning everything he could about the spice trade. Abraham ben Judah became his primary teacher and guide, introducing him to merchants who dealt in specific types of spices, to brokers who arranged transactions between buyers and sellers, to apothecaries who purchased spices for medicinal purposes. Rather than culinary use done, he learned to distinguish between the various grades of pepper, understanding that the finest black pepper came from the Malabar coast and commanded premium prices, while lesser grades might be mixed from various sources. He learned that white pepper was simply black pepper with the outer hull removed, a process that made it more suitable for certain dishes, but also more expensive due to the additional labor required. He spent hours with a merchant named Hassan who specialized in cinnamon, learning that true cinnamon came from Ceylon, while cassia, a related but distinct spice, came from various parts of Asia. The two looked similar to the untrained eye, but Hassan showed him how to distinguish them by color, texture, and aroma. Many merchants, Hassan explained through Abraham's translation, will sell cassia as true cinnamon, especially to buyers who do not know the difference. This is why reputation matters so greatly in our trade. A merchant known to be honest in his descriptions will earn more respect and better prices than one who seeks to deceive. Thomas also learned about the various routes that spices could take. The Red Sea route, which he had witnessed, was only one possibility. There was also the Persian Gulf route, where goods were landed at Basra and then transported overland through Baghdad to Damascus or Aleppo. This route had been more important in earlier centuries, but political instability in Persia and Mesopotamia had made it less reliable. There was talk, always in hushed tones and with uncertainty, of the overland route through Central Asia, the old Silk Road that connected China with the Middle East. This route had once carried enormous quantities of silk and other luxury goods, but Mongol invasions and the constant warfare between various kingdoms and empires had made it dangerous and difficult. Some merchants still used it, brave or desperate souls who were willing to face the risks for the enormous profits that success could bring. One evening, Thomas met an elderly merchant named Ismail, who claimed to have traveled the Silk Road in his youth. The old man's stories were fragmentary and difficult to verify, but they painted a picture of a journey of unimaginable hardship and wonder. "I traveled with a caravan for 18 months, Ismail said, his rheumy eyes distant with memory. From Samarkand through the deserts and mountains to Cathay. We lost men to bandits, to disease, to simple exhaustion. We crossed lands where the people had never seen a Muslim or heard of our prophet, peace be upon him. But we also saw cities of splendor, markets filled with silk and jade and porcelain, palaces decorated with gold and precious stones. Would such a journey still be possible? Thomas asked. Ismail shrugged. Perhaps for one with great resources and greater courage. But the profits from the sea routes are sufficient for most merchants, and the risks are smaller. Why risk death in the mountains when you can make good profit from goods that arrive by ship? As his time in Alexandria drew toward an end, Thomas realized that he had learned as much as he could in this city. He had seen the point where Eastern goods entered the Mediterranean world, but the question of their ultimate origins remained. The merchants in Alexandria could tell him that pepper came from the Malabar coast, but none had actually been there. They could describe the Indian Ocean trade network, but their knowledge was secondhand, derived from the reports of Arab and Indian merchants who actually made those journeys. They made their way through narrow streets crowded with people and animals and carts loaded with goods. The buildings were different from any Thomas had seen, with screens over windows and internal courtyards that offered privacy and shade from the intense sun. The dress of the people was varied. Egyptian men in flowing robes and turbans, women veiled and moving in small groups, Mamluk soldiers in distinctive uniforms, foreign merchants in their various national costumes, African slaves carrying heavy loads, and beggars calling out for alms. Marco had arranged lodging in a khan, a commercial building that combined warehouse space, living quarters for traveling merchants, and common areas where business could be conducted. The Khan al-Khalili was run by a Syrian Christian named Yusuf, who welcomed foreign merchants and who maintained good relationships with both the Muslim authorities and the various trading communities. Thomas was given a small room on an upper floor, sparsely furnished but clean, with a narrow window that looked down into the courtyard where merchants gathered in the evening to share meals and exchange news. That first evening, as the heat of the day finally began to diminish and the call to prayer echoed across the city from dozens of mosques, Thomas sat in the courtyard with Marco and several other merchants. There were Venetians and Genoese, a French trader from Marseille, an Armenian who dealt in silk, and a Jewish merchant whose family had lived in Alexandria for generations and who served as an intermediary between Christian and Muslim traders. The Jewish merchant, whose name was Abraham ben Judah, spoke several languages fluently and proved to be a valuable source of information. Alexandria has been a trading city for more than 1,000 years, he explained in careful Italian. Alexander the Great founded it. The Ptolemies made it great. The Romans ruled it, the Arabs conquered it, and now the Mamluks control it. But through all these changes, trade has continued. The spices you seek, Master Thomas, they come through here as they have for centuries, brought by ships from the Red Sea and by caravans overland from the ports of the Gulf. Is it possible, Thomas asked, to see where these caravans arrive? To witness the actual exchange of goods? Abraham smiled. Not only possible, but necessary if you truly wish to understand. Tomorrow, if you wish, I will take you to the great market where the spices are sold. It is a sight that few Europeans see, for most are content to purchase from intermediaries in the European quarter. But if Marco vouches for you, and if you conduct yourself with proper respect, I believe we can arrange for you to witness what you seek. Thomas could barely sleep that night, his mind filled with anticipation. He had traveled so far, learned so much, and now he was finally approaching the heart of the mystery that had set him on this journey. Tomorrow, he would see with his own eyes the point where East truly met West, where the products of distant lands changed hands and began their journey to the markets of Europe. Abraham ben Judah arrived at the Khan shortly after dawn, accompanied by a Mamluk soldier who Abraham explained had been hired as a guard and guide. It is not that the markets are dangerous, Abraham said, but a foreign merchant of obvious means traveling without protection might prove too tempting for pickpockets or worse. The sign here will ensure we have no difficulties. Hassan was a powerfully built man with a scarred face and watchful eyes. He wore a curved sword at his belt and carried himself with the confidence of someone trained in combat. He spoke no Italian, but Abraham translated when necessary, and the soldier nodded respectfully to Thomas and Marco. They set out through the morning streets of Alexandria. The city was already stirring, with shops opening their shutters, vendors setting up their stalls, and the first customers beginning their daily rounds of shopping and business. The architecture fascinated Thomas. Buildings with flat roofs and interior courtyards. Narrow streets that provided shade from the sun. Occasional glimpses through open doorways of fountains and gardens, hidden from public view. They passed mosques where the faithful were gathering for morning prayers. Churches of the Coptic Christians who had lived in Egypt since ancient times, and what Abraham identified as a synagogue serving the city's Jewish community. Alexandria was a cosmopolitan city where multiple faiths coexisted, not always harmoniously, but with a practical tolerance born of the need for trade and commerce. As they walked, Abraham provided commentary. The spice market is in the old quarter, near the customs warehouses. The Mamluks tax everything that enters or leaves the city, and they maintain strict records. This is actually beneficial for merchants, as it prevents fraud and ensures that quality standards are maintained. A merchant who sells false goods or uses deceptive weights will find himself barred from the market and possibly facing worse punishment. They turned into a broader street, and suddenly Thomas was assaulted by a wave of scent so powerful and complex that he stopped walking, simply breathing deeply and trying to identify the components. Cinnamon, certainly, and pepper, cloves. Something sweet and floral that might be rosewater, the sharp tang of ginger, and a dozen others he could not name. "We are close now," Abraham said with evident satisfaction. "The market is just ahead." They emerged into a large square surrounded by warehouses and covered market stalls. The activity was intense. Merchants stood beside piles of goods, calling out prices and descriptions in Arabic. Porters moved through the crowd, carrying heavy sacks on their backs or driving donkeys laden with cargo. Buyers examined merchandise, testing quality, negotiating prices, and arranging for transport. In one corner, scribes sat at low tables, drawing up contracts and bills of sale, their reed pens moving rapidly across parchment. Abraham led them to a particular section of the market, where the spices were concentrated. Here, Thomas saw for the first time the sheer variety and quantity of goods that came through Alexandria. There were dozens of different types of pepper alone, each with its own characteristics and price. Cinnamon of various grades, from the delicate pale sticks that commanded the highest prices to darker, thicker varieties that sold for less but were still valuable. Cloves piled in baskets, their distinctive shape and scent unmistakable. Nutmeg and mace, cardamom pods, saffron threads displayed in small quantities due to their extreme value. But there were also spices and ingredients Thomas did not recognize. Abraham pointed out various items, translating the Arabic names and explaining their uses. Sumac berries for their tart flavor, dried limes that have been preserved in salt, rose petals dried for use in sweets and medicines, various resins and gums used in perfumes and incense, seeds and roots and barks, each with its own purpose in cooking or medicine or religious ceremony. They approached one of the larger merchants, a portly man with an impressive beard and fine robes who Abraham knew from previous visits. After the ritual greetings and inquiries about health and family, Abraham introduced Thomas and Marco, explaining in Arabic that they were European merchants seeking to understand the spice trade. The merchant, whose name was Ahmad al-Misri, gestured for them to sit on carpets spread before his stall, and a boy brought small cups of thick, sweet coffee. Through Abraham's translation, Ahmad began to explain his business. I purchase from the wholesalers who deal directly with the caravans and ships arriving from the east. By the time the spices reach me, they have already changed hands several times. I inspect each lot carefully for quality, for there are always those who would mix good with bad to increase their profit. Then I sell to foreign merchants such as yourselves, or to local dealers who supply the households of the wealthy. Where did the spices originate? Thomas asked, and Abraham translated. Ahmad gestured expansively. From every corner of the world. The pepper comes from the Malabar coast, carried by Indian ships to ports in Arabia and Persia, then brought here by merchants who make that journey their life's work. The cinnamon comes from Ceylon, an island far to the east, and also from the lands of Java and Sumatra, which are even more distant. The cloves come from islands called the Moluccas, which lie so far away that the journey there and back can take 3 years. He picked up a handful of cloves and let them fall through his fingers. Consider the journey these have made. Harvested by people whose names we will never know, in a land that exists for us only as a rumor. Sold to traders who carry them to a port, perhaps weeks of travel through jungle. Loaded onto ships that sail for months across oceans vast and dangerous. Purchased in India or Ceylon by Arab merchants who transport them to Aden or Jeddah. From there, brought by ship up the Red Sea to a port near Cairo, or sent by caravan across the desert. In Cairo, sold again to merchants who bring them here to Alexandria. And from here, they will go to Venice or Genoa, to be distributed throughout Europe. Thomas tried to imagine this chain of transactions. Each merchant adding his profit, each transfer point collecting its taxes and fees. No wonder spices commanded such high prices in England. The true marvel was that the trade existed at all, that such precious goods could move across such vast distances without being lost or consumed along the way.